Join us as we dive into an amazing story about how President Theodore Roosevelt impacted the game of football and see if we can uncover what really happened in this episode of Theodore Roosevelt's involvement and what did he really do for football? How did it change? It's all coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. Football in the early 20th century was a brutal sport. Players were often battered and bruised, and fatalities were not uncommon. In 1905 alone, some 13 to 18 players died as a result of injuries sustained on the field, and many more were left with permanent disabilities. The most significant factor attributed to the rise of injury and fatality was the emergence of the mass momentum plays.
And so the game started steering towards this, what ultimately became mass and momentum football. So mass meaning, it was basically like playing goal line football, a goal line offense goal against goal line defense, all 110 yards of the field at the time. And so, the mass refers to the idea of multiple blockers leading the runner through the hole and or grabbing him by the handles that he had sewn on his pants to pull him through the hole. And the momentum referring to, back then they didn't have rules on how many players had to be on the line of scrimmage. So teams they had guards back or tackles back formations and different things. And there was no limit on the number of men who could be moving forward at the snap, similar to what Canada has in their football. And so, they'd have these guys running all at the same time and collapsing into a particular hole and just basically slamming into it to basically overrun one or two players on the defense. And so it was a very dangerous game. And as a result, there were lots of injuries and ultimately deaths, resulting from the nature of the play at the time.
The public was outraged and calls for reform were getting louder. Colleges and universities were under pressure to take action. Many were considering banning the sport altogether, fearing the liability of allowing such a dangerous activity on their campuses. It was clear that something needed to be done, and fast, to save the sport itself. As the debate raged on, the need for change became more pressing.
The thing about McCracken that's really interesting is, his most notable contribution to football was that, he was a guy who was making some noise about in the 1904, 1905 timeframe. He was making some noise about the danger of football and he was questioning its place as the rules existed at the time. And so he's making a little bit of noise on that, but NYU wasn't a big enough team that people really were going to pay too much attention to him. But then, later in the 1905 season, NYU was hosting Union College at Ohio Field, and a Union College player was killed during the game. So, I think he was alive when he left the field, but he died, shortly thereafter. And it was just one of those things where, McCracken just said, this has to stop. And so he, wrote to, kind of university presidents, chancellors, kind of all over the place, published some things in newspapers, and basically demanded that the rule that, that there was an existing rules organization. And he basically said, these people have not fixed this problem. They've had their chances. We're going to gather kind of a separate Congress or, group of people, come together in New York City, and we're going to we're going to develop new rules, new systems, whatever it takes to clean up the game. And so they ended up There were 60, 70 representatives from universities, primarily in the East, some in the Midwest, but Harvard was one of them. So that, was an important, contributing university to that whole thing. And out of that came the, what they called the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States. And so they met and they identified a subcommittee that was going to work on developing new rules. And but shortly after the turn of the year, so January of 2006, they essentially took that subcommittee and merged it with the existing rules making body.
So the sport was at a crossroads, and it was unclear which direction it would take. Would it continue down the path of brutality and danger, or would it evolve into something safer and more organized? It was tearing the fragile concept of college football apart into two divisions: the old guard of traditional rule supporters like Princeton and Yale, among others, and McCracken's band of reformists and the general public on the other. In the midst of the chaos, Theodore Roosevelt stepped in. As president, he had a reputation for being a strong leader who wasn't afraid to take action. And action he did take in early October 1905.
And so around that time, the Walter Camp style of play in American football, they were doing the mass plays, right? And a lot of that mass plays was still just plunging the line, and they weren't doing a whole lot of like end runs, and of course they didn't have the pass play, the forward pass play yet, and so it was just a lot of violence. 3 yards to gain, or excuse me, 3 downs to gain 5 yards. It's just a bunch of violence to gain 5 yards, and I imagine to the fan it probably didn't look a whole lot different than the rugby scrum. Sometimes when you're looking at what's going on in the field, right? Yeah. In 1904, after those many players died in one season, Teddy Roosevelt said, "Hey, we got to do something about this," and he told the colleges to get together and figure something out. Well, Walter Camp was, part of those rules makers, and actually, less than 2 weeks after that meeting, where Teddy Roosevelt assembled those college rules makers, less than 2 weeks later, Walter Camp traveled up to Hamilton, Ontario, and he watched a game that was played under the Burnside rules. And after that game, they had kind of a little banquet for him or whatever, because he was famous already. And during that banquet, he had some criticisms of the Canadian game, but he did say, though, that he saw value in 3 downs for 10 yards. That was one of the things that he noted. And then, sure enough, and actually it was 1906 that they changed the rules to go 3 downs for 10 yards. And that's the same year then that they adopted the forward pass. And so Walter Camp, it's not clear, of course, whether it's because of Thrift Burnside that American football then went to 3 downs for 10, but it certainly had an influence on Walter Camp. And if he had already been thinking about 3 downs for 10 yards, I think that game in Ontario maybe solidified it for him.
Roosevelt was motivated by more than just the public outcry. He was a football fan himself, and he believed in the importance of physical activity for young men. He saw the benefits of the sport, but he also saw the need to reform.
In life, as in a football game, the principle to follow is: hit the line hard, don't foul and don't shirk, but hit the line hard. I believe in rough games and in rough manly sports. I do not feel any particular sympathy for the person who gets battered about a good deal, so long as it is not fatal.
The president knew that if something wasn't done, and soon, the sport would be lost forever. On a crisp autumn day, October 9th, 1905, Roosevelt, using his political influence, summoned a gathering of football's elite to the White House. Concerned by the brutal nature of the game, he brought together coaches Walter Camp, Arthur T. Hildebrand, and William T. Reed, among others. Roosevelt couldn't force their hand, but he believed in their ability to reform the sport and preserve the spirit. He urged them to take action, to work together to create a set of rules that would make the game safer. Through the voice of Dr. William White, a professor of surgery at the University of Pennsylvania, Roosevelt set a gentleman's agreement of sorts to try and give the opposing groups some guidance to reform. This platform included uniform eligibility requirements for all schools, penalization of brutal conduct of players by officials in game and the school administrators afterwards, along with making the game officials accountable if they allowed any unruly violence. On December 28, 1905, representatives from 62 colleges and universities met. And out of this meeting came the Intercollegiate Football Association, the precursor to the NCAA. And with this group, the new rules were established that would transform the game. Some such as adding a fourth down to reach a 5 yards line to gain. A form of the forward pass was introduced, but it was filled with rules that made it really unfavorable to use. Reduction in the overall game time, separation of the game into halves, along with other rules and revisions to open up the game and reduce the heavy mass momentum violence. The meeting was a pivotal moment in the history of football. It marked the beginning of a new era, one in which safety and organization would take precedence, and it was all thanks to Roosevelt's intervention. The regulations were far-reaching, covering everything from the size of the playing field to the weight of the players' equipment. They were designed to make the game safer, and they did just that. Fatalities began to decline ever so slightly, but the game was starting to get just a little bit safer, and the sport started to flourish.
1906 was the year it was legalized, and it really did transform the game. And that was a mandate that President Roosevelt really brought to bear because of, as you mentioned, the dangers of the game. So many young men were either being critically injured or even dying, that he said, if you don't do something about this, he called leaders from East Coast teams, but also Mr. Stagg together and said, you have to change the way this game is played, or we're going to have to get rid of it because it's just not sustainable. And so one of those changes that was introduced was the forward pass. And it's hard for us, I think, to imagine the game without it. But at the time, we just recently celebrated the 150th anniversary of college football. So from 1869 through the early 1900s, it was just a brutal running game, very much likened to war. And it just kind of stood to reason that men would be injured. And so the introduction of the forward pass really opened up the playing field, and it obviously spread. It provided for spread formations and a much more open game that relied on speed and skill.
Roosevelt's actions are believed that the president didn't just save the sport, they helped it grow into a popular phenomenon that it is today. Without his intervention, it's possible that football would have faded into obscurity, a relic of a bygone era. But what impact did Roosevelt really have in changing the game? He gets much of the credit, but what is the reality of the historic meeting?
So, I mean, I think the whole thing with Roosevelt is a little bit overblown, but, it was more, I think it was a high profile act on his part. I mean, there's nothing he could do to ban football, right? But, he was a football supporter. He was a fan. He was at the 1905 Army-Navy game at the end of the season. His son played for Harvard, at least the freshman team at the time. And he was a big believer in, kind of that whole masculinity thing that was behind, football at the time. So he was a fan. So he wanted to make sure the game continued. And at the end of the day, Harvard, Yale, and Princeton controlled the game. They were still even in 1904, 1905. They were the three schools. Penn maybe a little bit, but they were the schools that controlled the game. and they had core responsibility for the rulemaking bodies. It wasn't until 1904 that a non-Easterner, so Emerson Alonzo Stagg, who had played at Yale but was coaching at Chicago, he was the first non-Easterner on the rules committee. So, anything that was wrong with football, it was due to the guys out east.
Thanks to Roosevelt, he funneled and was the impetus to force the old school ideas of camp in Eastern schools. With that, the voices of concerned public outcry and the university presidents, along with the innovators such as Stagg and McCracken and Heisman, so that the ideas of football became a safer, more organized sport. The more changes would follow, as this was a significant step towards the modern game, and in doing so, it became a beloved part of American culture. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts on this crazy story in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our other videos on sports history and the influential figures, and hit that subscribe button and notification bell for future references. Till next time, everybody, have a great Gridiron Day. That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.